another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Welcome in. Happy Monday. Hope you had yourself a great weekend. I had an awesome weekend. And I know this is kind of like the old typical cliche, not even just for myself, but for everybody in this business, I feel like, talking about the weather. But it could not have been a more beautiful weekend for college football, kicking off the NFL, being outdoors, all that good stuff. It could not have been a more beautiful weekend, and I certainly enjoyed pretty much every bit of it. And it all got started on Friday night with a massive Indiana football win that I will react to with our man Mitchell Paige here in a little bit. But I guess just some initial thoughts. If you didn't happen to see the post-game show on Friday, which, by the way, thank you to all those who have been checking out those live post-game shows that we've been doing. Great response from them so far, and we are going to continue to do them as often as I'm available, as often as somebody on the staff at Hoosier Illustrated is available to do them on the particular game day and or night. So thank you to all those who checked those out. Again, we'll be planning on doing another one this Saturday at the conclusion of the Indiana versus UCLA game. But yeah, anyway, great stuff from that. And we'll talk a little more, again, with Mitchell Paige about what all went down with the Hoosiers as they completely tore apart, piece by piece, the Western Illinois Leathernecks. And I think one thing that's been really trying to keep Indiana fans grounded in how massive of a win this ended up being is the fact that you were playing against a school that is really one of the most horrendous FCS programs currently in college football. And I remember hearing somebody say this the other day, they've had decent seasons, I believe, back in the 90s, but, we're far removed from that. This is a whole new college football world that we are in. And Western Illinois has not been good for quite some time. Been a while since they've won a game, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, it's good just to see an Indiana football team take care of business the way that we haven't seen them do in several years now. And so I think that's probably the most exciting thing about all of this is the fact that at least through 2 games, this Curt Cignetti regime looks like it's created a mindset within this Indiana football program that we haven't experienced in a while. And that's exciting. And again, I'll react to more of what happened with our man Mitchell Paige once we get through a little bit more of this opening segment here. But man, first of all, before we get into some of the results from this weekend, and man, it was an insane week 2 in college football. I feel like no matter what year it is, it still always hits me specifically like a truck whenever you get the first week of college football and there's upset after upset, games you don't expect to happen or play out the way that they do. And man, I've got a whole slew of these that I want to get through and kind of react to what happened here in just a moment. But one thing I want to remind you guys to do, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Hoosier Illustrated, if you haven't already. We're trying to get to 500 subscribers right now. I believe we're around 417-ish. I'm not looking at it right at the moment, but I believe we're in that ballpark. But as soon as we get to 500 subscribers, we will be eligible to monetize this channel, which is the next big step forward for Hoosier Illustrated and HoosierIllustrated.com as well. So if you're watching this right now and you enjoy the content that's being produced, whether it be this show, whether it be talking about the Hoosiers, whether it be the new post-game shows, or even if you like watching the post-game pressers from the Hoosier Illustrated point of view, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Hoosier Illustrated, and I would greatly appreciate it. Alec and Kyler obviously would greatly appreciate it as well. But that is the next step forward for us and for the website. And so if you feel so kind to do so, hit that subscribe button right below. If you're watching on YouTube, which you have to be, that's the only way to watch this show currently, then just look right below, see that subscribe button, hit the little red button, I believe that it is. And yeah, that's all there is to it. There's no signing up, doesn't cost you anything. You don't even have to hit the notifications bell if you don't want to. We would greatly appreciate that as well, but you don't have to do that unless you want to be notified of when every last video is goes up on our channel. So that's my little spiel about that. I'm going to try to be more on top of reminding folks to do that, just because I don't feel like I've done a very good job at, just kind of talking about how important it is to have subscribers to our channel. So appreciate those of you who already are subscribed, but if you're just now doing it, appreciate you as well, and we're glad to have you on board. As always, a sip of that delicious, delicious brown sugar coffee from Notting Hill Cafe. No sponsor. If they were, I'd plug the hell out of them. But unfortunately, they are in the state of Delaware, and they probably could not care less about Indiana Hoosiers sports, or really any sports within the state of Indiana, or maybe sports in general. What is there sporting wise in the state of Delaware that may be of interest to them? Probably nothing, unless I'm just unaware. So let's get into some of these games, some of these results from this weekend. And by the way, I guess one more thing I want to mention for those of you who've been following along with the betting picks, went 3 for 4 this week with the college football picks. So if you happen to get in on some of that action with me, good for you. The one that we did miss was probably the one that I was the most confident in last Friday or last week, and that was Iowa to cover against Iowa State. And obviously looking back on it now, it was a bit of an overreaction to Iowa really dismantling Illinois State 40-0, thinking they had kind of turned their offense around, and they had some issues against Iowa State. They ended up losing the game by 1, and that was the one nick that we took on the betting front in the college football space this week. But we got everything else. Nebraska completely destroyed Colorado, which I guess I'll go ahead and react to that for a moment here. I'm ready for the Deion Sanders train to die down. And I know some of you listening, we've talked about this a little bit. I know I don't mean to. I'm not. Whenever I attack Deion Sanders, and obviously he doesn't care what I say, but whenever I go in on Deion Sanders, I'm not trying to tarnish his legacy as a player, because he was obviously a revolutionary, legendary player in the world of football in general. But I'm talking about him specifically as the head coach at Colorado, with all of the nonsensical talk that he's done over, especially this season. I feel like he was able to back it up a little bit last year due to the start that they had, being 4-0, and you had a decent win against a TCU program to kick off the college football season. But this year, you barely beat North Dakota State from the FCS, and now you go into Lincoln, and you don't even look like you belong on the same field as Nebraska. You play selfishly. And that's if Deion Sanders, this is where Deion Sanders is really going to have a chance to prove himself, like if he's worthy of being this level of a head football coach, because he's going to have to figure out how to rally his troops together and actually not play selfishly for themselves like Shedeur Sanders appears to do every time he's out there on the field. So I don't expect him to do that. Nebraska covering that 7.5 felt like free money. What did they end up winning that game by? It was a lot. Let me pull up the Big Ten scoreboard here for me real quick. Nebraska, that final score was 28-10. And, obviously most of that was done in the first half. They were up 28-0. But I guess they just, played good enough defense to get the job done. But Nebraska, I think they're going to end up being pretty decent. I'm very much looking forward to when Indiana takes on the Cornhuskers right smack dab in the middle of the season. I know we've pinpointed that game as potentially being one of the most fun environments for Indiana football this year, if, of course, Indiana does their part and takes care of business on their side of things as well. But the other two betting picks that hit for me, the other one that was a sure thing, Tennessee completely handled NC State on the road. Tennessee starting to look like the real deal when it comes to, I guess, them taking their next step in I guess making their program more relevant again. They won 51-10 against NC State. That spread was, I believe, 8.5, so that wasn't even close. And then the other one that we hit in the Big Ten, it was Rutgers minus 22 or 22.5. Rutgers ended up winning 49-17. So 3 for 4, feeling pretty good after that when it comes to the college football betting. And I won't even speak on my NFL betting this weekend because it was not as good. And I just wanted to get on some action, put together a little $5 parlay. And, it reminded me I'm not good at betting the NFL. And maybe I'll stay away from that. in the future unless I just see something that looks like a sure thing. But betting the NFL is, to me, a whole lot more harder. I don't even know if that phrase makes sense. A lot more hard, a lot more difficult to do. And part of that is probably because I don't take in as much NFL as maybe some of you do. Now that I'm doing fantasy football, I did find myself paying a lot more attention than I had in previous years. So that's something that I'm excited about, and maybe we'll talk about here in a little bit. But might be staying away from the betting when it comes to the National Football League, at least for the early going. We'll see. Let's react to some of these other games, though. Texas slaughtering Michigan. And this goes back to what I've kind of been saying for a little bit now. And I do believe I mentioned it during the conversation with Mitchell Paige as well. But Michigan, I'm not really sure how good they're actually going to be. And I don't think Sharon Moore is a bad head coach. I think he'll be good enough, at least for a little bit. But obviously, when you're in Michigan, the standard's different. And especially when you're coming off a national championship, if you kind of lay an egg of sorts and maybe go 8-4, something along those lines, 9-3, yeah, you'll get some grace because you are coming off that national title game and you were the offensive coordinator on that team, of course. But they're not going to expect that to be the standard for long. They're going to expect him to get back up to winning those national titles. And maybe they miss Connor Stallions more so than before, right? I know Michigan fans are kind of aggravated with all of that, but hey, it's still the Connor Stallions happened whether they like it or not. But you know, they also still got their national championship, and they're not going to get that revoked, I don't believe. So either way, Texas goes into the big house, takes care of business, wins 31-12. They were favored by 7, so they beat that out or blew that out of the water. Quinn Ewers looking like he may be one of the best quarterbacks in college football right now. And obviously it's only 2 weeks in, but a lot of people who are picking early Heisman favorites are penciling in Quinn Ewers. This may be the best Texas team we've seen, I don't want to say in my lifetime. I'll say since I've been paying attention to college sports. Obviously, I'm a young gun. I'm only 27, and I've really only been following college sports, really into Indiana football at the very least since I was maybe 10 or 11. That may even be too young if I'm being honest. I can't remember all the specifics. None of that really matters, I guess. But Texas has never really been super good in those times. There's always been the years where people are like, oh, Texas is back, and they end up not really being so back. And obviously, it's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing in the SEC since this is their first year in that conference. And them along with Kirby Smart in Georgia, as well as Alabama, they will be probably the early favorites right now when it comes to winning the SEC. And speaking of which, before we move on, I don't know if any of you all have already seen the new AP poll for this week. I'm trying to pull it up right now so I can reference it. But it is, and I know obviously both the Big Ten and the SEC have a lot more teams than they used to. But if you look at the top 10 alone, number 1, number 2, number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7, those ranked teams are all part of the SEC. That is mind-boggling. It's just something that I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but maybe it is. Number 3, number 8, and number 9 all belong to Big Ten teams. And then that leaves number 10 of Miami of the ACC, and that's it. But the SEC, they're, again, very top heavy. I don't think they are as strong as they're made out to be, as always. And I mean, no conference really is. I mean, a lot of their big teams have already taken some losses. LSU. There's somebody else that I'm thinking of, or at least the name is escaping me. Maybe I'm just thinking of LSU potentially. But either way, just wanted to point out the AP poll and how SEC dominant it appears to be so far. Anyway, let's move on. The other big upset, or I mean, there was more than the other. There was one for sure that I'm about ready to get into, and some of you may know what I'm about ready to say. This was probably the upset of the week, and that was Northern Illinois of the Mid-American Conference. Just not destroying, but taking down Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish, on a last-second field goal. And my goodness, what a way to, by the way, here's what I was forgetting. Texas A&M, that's who also took a loss. They lost Notre Dame, of course. But that's how, when you're Marcus Freeman and you follow up a big win like that with a clunker at home to probably one of the easiest opponents that you had left on your schedule. And Notre Dame doesn't really have that difficult of a schedule, for being honest. They play 9 home games, only 3 true road games the entire season. They already played one of those. So they're going to have plenty of chances to, keep that record bolstered. And speaking of that top 25 that we mentioned earlier, with Northern Illinois entering in at 25, they're doing Notre Dame a favor by making that win look a lot better than it might actually be. Now, if Northern Illinois ends up being the best team in the G5 and maybe goes 12-0 and wins the MAC, then they'll easily be that G5 qualifier for the college football playoff. And in turn, if you're Notre Dame, you want that to happen because that only makes your loss look that much better as you get into the rest or go through the rest of the season, and you don't want your playoff hopes to be diminished. So very interesting loss for Notre Dame. I mean, I happen to think they'll probably take a few more losses. I mean, maybe it was just a fluke, and maybe Northern Illinois really is as good as, good enough to be in that top 25, but we'll have to wait and see. What else? Oregon had trouble with Boise State. Second week in a row where Oregon has kind of struggled with a team that they probably should have beaten a little easier. They struggled with Idaho in week 1 of the FCS, excuse me. Now, Boise State is expected to be one of the other G5 teams who may be vying for a college football playoff spot. So there is a chance that Boise State really isn't something to be too upset about, only beating 3 by. So Oregon only wins out by 3. Kind of a shaky start for the Ducks, considering they have such high expectations so far this season. But we'll move forward from there. Penn State had a little trouble with Bowling Green. Tom Allen, the defensive coordinator, obviously, with the Nittany Lions this year. And that game was in question for a while. Penn State coming off their win against West Virginia on the road, following that up with, again, a little bit of a clunker of a performance at home against Bowling Green, again, of the Mid-American Conference. But they get the job done. They still win. And the Nittany Lions move to 2-0 on the season. And that's one thing, again, that's fun about these early weeks in college football. You don't really know. A lot of these teams are not well-oiled machines yet, and they're not going to put in the most convincing of performances. And so you're going to find results like that. But moving on, a good win for the Big Ten here. Number 19, Kansas, falls to the Illinois Fighting Illini in Champaign. And a big win for Brett Bielema. Probably is maybe his best win of the season so far since he's been the head coach at Illinois. I believe this is his 3rd season. And really good win for them. They stormed the field. Kind of awkward to see just because Kansas is kind of known historically for being a team that really isn't that good. I know they've had some good years with their current head coach, Lance Leipold. But it was just kind of funny seeing Kansas get stormed on when, years ago, they'd be doing the storming because they weren't any good. So kind of funny to see there. And then I mentioned Iowa and Iowa State earlier. Very disappointing from the Hawkeyes. And really not much else to just add other than the fact that maybe their offense isn't going to take as big of a step forward as we thought. And I know we're about to talk with Mitchell here in a few minutes, but when I keep thinking about some of these overreactions from previous weeks, it does get me a little worried. Are we overreacting to Indiana through 2 weeks and they haven't really played anybody? And they're going to get, obviously, their first test at a power opponent with UCLA this Friday. But really hope Indiana doesn't get caught in the crossfire that we've seen with some of these other teams as, they end up not having the performance that they want to put together. But anyway, we'll talk more about that with Mitchell here in a moment. Want to get through, at least there's one more I've got on here. Yeah. So the other upset, at least when it comes to the top 25, was Syracuse upsetting Georgia Tech. Is that really that big of an upset? I mean, obviously it's early, and Georgia Tech did beat Florida State in Ireland in week 0. But since then, Florida State, they haven't won a game yet this year. And I know they were off, I believe, right, in week 3, because I know they've already played 2 games. But because, Florida State taking that second loss to Boston College in their second matchup of the year. So maybe that Georgia Tech win isn't as big as people thought. Again, only time will tell with that. But they lost to Syracuse, giving them their first L on the season. But I do believe that keeps Syracuse undefeated if I'm not mistaken. Let me take a look here. Yeah, Syracuse 2-0 on the year after that. And by the way, former Ohio State quarterback Kyle McCord on that Syracuse team. He had a wonderful day, nearly 400 yards, 4 touchdowns. So maybe Syracuse will end up being a decent team in the ACC. So there's a bit of your college football rundown from the week. Man, that was fun. I'm so glad college football is here. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more of the NFL once this Mitchell segment, making it seem like it's, I'm not trying to push away our man Mitch, of course. But once on the other side, I'll say that's a better way to put it. On the other side, we'll react to a little bit of what happened in the NFL in week 1. Maybe talk a little bit about fantasy football. Again, I don't know how much the audience really cares about what's going on with my fantasy team. But feel free to tell me how your fantasy team did in the YouTube comments. Or, as always, haven't mentioned the hotline yet. Hit that hotline. Let me know, 502-830-9195. And react to anything that we're talking about. Tell me about what you think of the Hoosiers. What you think of the Colts. What you think of anything else that's going on in college football or the NFL. Or, again, your fantasy football team. But on the other side, after Mitchell Paige comes in with us, we'll react to a little bit of what happened in week 1. And obviously, we got one more game tonight. We got Monday Night Football between the Jets and the 49ers. So without further ado, here's our man Mitchell Paige. This is In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Joining me now once again is the man, the myth, the legend, Mitchell Paige himself. Happy Monday, my friend. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome, man. What a weekend.
Did you have a good weekend?
I did. Anytime you can start with 77-3.
77-3. And we'll obviously dive a little bit more into that in just a moment. But man, I don't really think anybody was expecting just that type of performance from Indiana. Just because for so long, I mean, Indiana has had just this notorious kind of just really their standard has always been, you know what, they'll win maybe 30-something, 40-something to 7 or 10. Or even if you go all the way back to whenever you were playing with Kevin Wilson, when they play the caliber team like this, when you all beat Indiana State 73-35, the big caveat with that game is somehow Indiana found a way to give up 35 points against an FCS team. Whereas this time you kind of did the damn thing in all 3 phases, and you've got people really as high as they've been in 3 or 4 years in Indiana football, maybe even higher, depending on who you ask.
Yeah. I mean, it was outside of the one drive to end the first half, which I know they're just going to get ripped for. Because if you paid attention to the stats, and I was in the stadium, so they were flashing in front of me, not like I was diving into it, but up until that drive, I'm pretty sure they only had 1 first down in the entire first half. It was like 24 first downs to 1. There was just a clinic in execution.
I don't think they had any first downs up until that point, because it was a string of first downs, I believe, in that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like that's how it played out.
1 was at the most. It may have been 0. And it just felt like a clinic. Anytime you can do that, it's not Division I FBS, but they're still Division I football players. Winning is hard, as evidenced by Notre Dame, top 5 team in the country, going down at home. Anytime you can blow the brakes off of somebody and you do it, we talked about the jump that you make from first to second week. They were a little sloppy on offense in the first game, still found a way to win, whatever it was, 31-7. That same FIU team has Central Michigan come into town. That's a middle-of-the-pack MAC team, not some powerhouse, but beat them by 50. Like, it's a much better team than, at least through the first 2 weeks, that I think anybody was given credit for. And then you beat a team by 74 that's struggling, program looking for some direction for sure. But you still got to score the touchdowns. You still got to get the stops. You still have to have so many plays, even from your backups, your walk-ons that get in the game, of correct fits, correct execution, correct assignments, to win that convincingly and set a record that's been in place for 120 years. A clinic. Really excited for Saturday.
You mentioned the backups. Like, the backups can very easily just come in and go through the motions and enjoy just being in the game. But these backups, and I don't know exactly how many of Indiana's players got on the field, but Cignetti did say he emptied the bench. So I'm assuming almost everybody, if not everybody, got in the game. But to have even those players, I mean, those were the guys who were making the turnovers. I don't think Indiana had a single turnover from the starters. I think all 2 or 3 turnovers, I can't remember the exact number, that the Hoosiers had came from guys who were sitting on the bench the entire game.
Exactly. And what's even more impressive, and maybe they do a better job, the walk-ons and backup guys than I did, but you referenced the Indiana State game that we won 73-35. That was the first game I ever got to play in.
Okay.
And they threw us all out there. We hadn't been in a single offensive meeting since spring. We didn't run our stuff one time. We were just doing all scout team stuff. So they haven't been in any meetings, made any adjustments, learned really the offense at all. There's a bunch of freshmen out there, and for them to go out and execute even on the level that they did, they moved the ball consistently. Both quarterbacks that were in there, offensive line did phenomenal. It just looked poised, and yeah, it's a lot easier when you're up by 60, but they don't have any real direction is my guess when they go running out there. It's the first game for a lot of those kids. To continue to execute was extremely impressive and speaks to the kind of consistency throughout the program.
You mentioned you were at the game on Friday. What was the atmosphere kind of like? I know last week a big topic of conversation, not even from you specifically, but just among the fan base in general, was fans leaving the stadium after halftime. And I know Friday night games are kind of an anomaly, so maybe judging the crowd based on a Friday is not necessarily the best thing to do. But since you were there in person, I'm just curious your thoughts on how it looked.
Yeah, I was obviously pretty harsh last week. But the expectations this week are a lot different. I'll start with Fridays. Friday college football games are the dumbest thing. I understand that you need them for TV, extra commercial time. They're the dumbest thing that I can even imagine, especially for a Big Ten program. Add in the 42.5-point favorite. That stadium was never going to be full, but the crowd was a lot better than I anticipated it being. And then after halftime, it's 50-0 or 50-3, whatever it is. And you maybe lost 20%, which is very solid. It's a big improvement, I think, from last week. Go out and beat UCLA. Charlotte comes to town. Who knows what that looks like? But hopefully you're starting to generate some buzz as a program. You beat UCLA. Now you do the win and will come. People kind of hit them right in the face and expect a really good crowd at Charlotte with a chance to get to 4-0 would be my hope. Got to obviously take care of business in the Rose Bowl, but if they can execute even half as well as they just did, I don't anticipate. I think the spread was 2.5, opened at 2.5.
It's at 3 now.
I already bet it at -3, and it's my biggest bet of the year. Indiana to cover. I think that they're.
Now, let me cut you off real quick while you're getting your thoughts together. One thing that's crazy to think about. I think if you play this game in week 1, I bet UCLA's favored by 8.5, 9 points. All it takes sometimes is a little swing. And I know we haven't seen a lot of UCLA. The one game they played in, they looked like they could have lost to a group of 5 Hawaii team out in the islands, and they were off in week 2. So I know it's a tiny sample size, but I feel like even if Indiana teams of the past, right, that aren't executing like the Cignetti team, I should say, in 2 games has done, they wouldn't be favored in a game like this.
No. I saw a stat that it was the first time they've been favored since 2020 on the road.
Who would that even have been against? I mean, I know 2020 was a really good team, but who would they have been?
At Michigan State.
Gotcha.
Yep. I don't think this game will be particularly close. And I think that's because of what UCLA showed in week 1. If you watched Hawaii, they don't have really any skill, it feels like. They look slow. They look sluggish. Not necessarily that physical, at least in the first game. Now there's going to be a lot of improvements from them too. Week 1 to week 2, they still have that jump, but Indiana already took that jump and is going to have some momentum versus I bet that it's still like 6-hour plane ride, 7-hour plane ride back from Hawaii. You sit there and stew about almost losing to a Hawaii team that not sure they're going to win 6 games, maybe 7 games this year against a schedule that's not going to be in the Big Ten. You probably don't feel very good about it for a while, and you've had 2 weeks to think about it, and you're coming to play an Indiana team that
is in a rhythm, and you're not.
Yes.
If you're UCLA, they are the furthest thing away from in a rhythm.
There is no rhythm. That's what I was trying to get to. It felt like their game was clunky. Indiana felt a little clunky, but they still steamrolled. The game was never in question in the first week. Hawaii was just going to win. It felt like the most of the game, and UCLA held on for dear life. So Indiana's got 2 games that were in hand early and have just been able to make slight corrections with positive momentum on both sides of the ball and in the kicking game. I think that they're going to – I don't anticipate this game being very close.
I'm kind of with you, and I'm sure there'll be some people that watch this, maybe not necessarily from the UCLA side, and maybe there won't be anybody who watches this outside of the Indiana side, of course, but it wouldn't surprise me if we had a big enough audience to where people from other fan bases were watching this. It wouldn't surprise me if people get the perspective of, oh, these guys are just homers. They're just feeling good about their team. If you sit down and watch the amount of highly executed plays that there were, especially, and again, it's tough to find really the balance of what to say, what's Indiana versus how bad Western Illinois was. But I think whenever we think about what we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years with Indiana football and the lack of nastiness, the lack of really just overall will to win, and just doing the simple things like blocking if you're an offensive lineman, or, actually scoring on offense. That's something that we've, as Indiana fans, have been clamoring about since Kalen DeBoer left. Indiana's not had a formidable offense since Kalen DeBoer moved on to Fresno State, and look where he's at now, obviously coaching Alabama. And they had a closer than more than how do I phrase this? They were a little closer with
that
USF.
Score was not indicative of how the game was played. I was shocked to wake up and see the score watching late in the third quarter. I think it was like 18-12 or 16-12, whatever it was. That was a football game. And Alabama, I think, similar to how all those bigger teams, they just weigh on you. And that's why the Alabamas are the Alabamas and other teams aren't. It's depth. As a game goes on, you wear on them. Indiana, when I was there, used to feel the same thing with Ohio State or Michigan. Felt like we'd punch them in the face and hang around. And then at the end, the depth just wins games. Their backups are a little bit better than ours, and then their third string's a lot better than ours. That's how you build winning football. But yeah, I tweeted about this, and if you go down Indiana's schedule, and maybe it's not today anymore. Nope, still is. If you go down on the ESPN app through the matchup predictor.
I saw you references. I'll let you finish your point, but this is really intriguing.
Yeah, this is not me. This is not Indiana bias. This is not Never Daunted Twitter accounts. This is the ESPN analytics that are just telling me who's going to win. This is a matchup predictor. It has nothing to do with the spread. It's based purely on the analytics that ESPN runs. Indiana is predicted to win 10 games. According to the ESPN app. This is not me saying it. This is nothing to do with us, John. This is totally unbiased, completely objective. This is a computer that's spitting this out. And I got some serious troll messages. Listen, I say stupid stuff that's very opinionated. This is the app telling me. So you have reason to believe that, Indiana going to UCLA has a 3/5 chance to win at the Rose Bowl. Last year, that game would have been 80-20. You saw what Nebraska just did to Colorado, who stinks, I think, by the way.
Yes, they're horrible.
That team is terrible. Nebraska, number 23 Nebraska, on the 19th comes to Indiana, and the ESPN analytics, John, not me, not you, give Indiana a 57.9% chance to win. That's significant. This is not a toss-up.
This is something that, and again, I don't know exactly what all of these metrics are based off of, but whenever I've gone through these in the past, Indiana is hardly ever favored. Even in years where Indiana's had success, like Tom Allen went 8-4 back in 2019, they were not favored in a lot of the analytical matchups whenever they went 8-4 that year.
You want to see the most interesting change since I looked yesterday?
I think I know what it is because I was going to point it out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I tweeted 10-2, and I think they can beat Michigan. Well, I'm going to hold this up if you're watching on YouTube. You see what that says? That's for Michigan. Michigan.
Basically a toss-up.
52.4 to 47.6. Michigan is probably going to win, but the spread is 5%. We're not crazy. The analytics are seeing a team that's executing at a high level. Players all over the field. That the running back room is deep. Even when the quote unquote scrubs, the guys that are freshmen that have been on campus for 5 seconds, they run hard. They stick their foot in the ground. They run between the tackles. They're fast. They're explosive. They have playmakers at every position. They have a cornerback that probably still hasn't seen one pass all season in D'Angelo Pons or whatever his name is. Is it Pons or Pounds?
It's D'Angelo Pons.
Pons. I always want to say
Pounds would be D'Angelo Pons is already a cool enough name, but if it was Pounds, man, that would just add a little more to it.
That's why I want it to be Pounds. I think it rolls. But I mean, that kid, he walks around the field with an air of confidence. Quarterbacks drop back at least in the first 2 games and don't even look at him. When you have it's reminiscent of Tywan Mullen when he was having his big year. You just don't throw it at him, and that makes defense so much easier. You have linebackers that are willing to come up, support the run, and cause all kinds of havoc. You have defensive linemen that are quick off the ball. They have players that the computers, not me, computers, see something that a lot of fans don't want to see yet when they say, oh, well, let's win some games first. And yeah, you got to go out there and win. But I can't remember the last time that Indiana was favored in 8 of the remaining 10 games on their schedule after they were already 2-0.
And one thing that's crazy to add to that, especially about the UCLA game specifically, we talked before the season about how this was a pivotal moment, and it still is, but we saw it more so as like a toss-up. Like this is that 50-50 game that if it goes Indiana's way, then that's the door opens for a really good season. Again, that's also still the case, minus, I think, the 50-50 toss-up. I think at this point, fans, the team, probably even pundits, obviously Vegas, they expect Indiana to win this game at this point. So I think it's just wild that we've already kind of taken a step forward with Curt Cignetti as the head coach to where there is a vibe surrounding the Hoosiers where I would guess, and again, this is just a guess, that most of the fans that are really watching this Indiana football team think that they will go down and beat UCLA this weekend and probably shouldn't have any trouble doing so.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. The people that are paying attention, this is still a very pivotal game because it's the first time you go on the road, you fly across the country, you play in an awesome place.
Yeah, this isn't like going down and playing WKU in Southwest Kentucky, that's weird in and of itself, but you know.
This is their first real road trip into one of the most famous stadiums in the world, and you got to go out there and handle business. And Curt Cignetti strikes me as a guy that will ensure that we're handling our business as opposed to sightseeing. But it's transformed into where I think right before the season we talked about it, this is one you really want to get. And if they get this one, some really cool things can happen. You still have a little bit of that nerve just because you don't know how they're not road tested, how they're going to respond. But it feels like a game that you almost not have to win, but really expect to win if you want to do some of the things that I think this team is capable of, even in year one.
And if Indiana does go out and take care of business, let's just say they don't win by 3 or 4, whatever. Let's say they win this by 17 or even more than that. I think anything's really on the table because I really don't think UCLA is going to be that good.
My spread is like 12. in my head. That's where I would have stopped throwing the house at Indiana is minus 12.
Well, if Indiana does that, I think that's the point where you start to see receiving votes in the polls.
Yes.
People on national coverage at least start realizing, hey, there's something going on in Bloomington that hasn't been done since 1920. And that's when, I don't want to say you're going to have a target on your back just yet, but that's when the rest of the Big Ten's going to realize, okay, this Cignetti guy wasn't just talking a load of crap. This dude's really changing things. And that's when it's going to be important to really keep an eye on really how they respond when they play the other big guys. Because then after that, you're going to probably be a little big-chested if you take care of business. You don't want to have a letdown against Charlotte. That sets up perfectly for you to win. I don't see any scenario where you lose to Charlotte regardless, but that sets up a scenario where if you're too big, puffy-chested, you could maybe beat Charlotte by way less than you're actually supposed to. And then, that brings you back down to earth a little bit.
Yeah. We thought the schedule was favorable, but it feels like they get tough games in spurts, and then they get a chance to breathe. And this time you get a chance to breathe with Charlotte, but their bye weeks are perfect. They get some big boys that who knows if you do some great stuff, you've got a bye week to probably have the worst week of practice that you can imagine because they're going to be all over you thinking, we can win every game. We're the best team ever. Cignetti does not seem to mess with that. He was furious, obviously, going in at halftime when you're up 50-3. Like, it's
because all I could think about was the drive that just happened
and I
before that, where they score a field goal.
This morning thinking about it, yesterday thinking about it, and we'll wake up thinking about it until Saturday. And I promise you, it'll be referenced in the game on Saturday. It just, for whatever reason, and I was talking to Laura about this, it just feels different watching them than it has in a long time. It feels like they're so business-like. It doesn't feel fluffy. They go out there and they handle their business. They do what they need to do. It feels like they make a sack, there's a little celebration, and then almost like robots, they go back and line up. Like, it's
the football robot stuff we mentioned about Cignetti.
It's
instilling that mentality in the entirety of your team.
It feels like the team has started to take shape of the head coach, and he's proven that wins at a lot of levels. He hasn't proven it quite yet in the Big Ten, but the only indicators we have of these two games, you beat a team in FIU handily and don't play that well. And then FIU second week goes out and beats a MAC team by 50. We saw what the MAC was doing this weekend with Bowling Green in Northern Illinois. There's some skill there. Toledo is an awesome, like they've got skill in the MAC. FIU beats them by 50. And then you break a 120-year-old record on offense, scoring 77 points in week 2. The only thing that we have to really base our judgment on is those 2 weeks, A+ so far, right? So I think that's why you start to get a little bit excited, because Maryland's not good. Michigan State's not good. Northwestern's not good. Rutgers is – but we don't even play Rutgers.
No.
Huge.
Rutgers covered for me, though, this week. Rutgers, so I'll give them a shout out there.
Rutgers is one of the scariest teams in the Big Ten. Lucky us, don't have to play them this year. They've been our snake in the grass every single year for the last 5 years. They've just beaten us like a pulp. So you miss those guys. Michigan looks bland.
And I'll say this, too, about Michigan. I've already said it before. I'm going to keep saying it because I don't feel like a lot of people were saying it before the season started. And I think Sharon Moore's a bum. I don't think he's going to last more than a couple of years at Michigan. He may put together a decent season, be like 8-4. Maybe next year they're like, similar or a little bit worse. I just don't think with the whole handing off head coaching duties to your coordinator, I don't know when that's ever worked. Maybe I'm wrong, but I couldn't tell you a scenario when that's ever worked.
Yeah, at least in the first real big test, that's about as boring and unimaginative football team as I saw all weekend. They just got beat up, and I think that's a lot to do with Texas being really good. I think they've got skill all over the field. They play fast. Their offensive line has started 400 million games. They're all old. strong, experienced linemen. So Michigan was going to struggle with them. I was mostly disappointed with Michigan's offense. Didn't really feel like they had any identity, and maybe, again, speaks more to Texas on the D line, but they were just getting bullied. So I'm not saying throw the house at Indiana versus Michigan, but you start to really dive into the schedule now that you've seen two examples of what the Hoosiers can be, and it just sets up even the flow of the schedule sets up so favorably. Not even just the opponents, when the bye weeks come, who we play when, a little bit backloaded, but you get to a game like Michigan and you're 8-2 or something, or 7-2, and you're ranked. Football is about momentum. Who knows what could happen if you go into a game like that and Michigan's 7-2 as well. It's shaping up to be one of the most interesting years in Indiana, at least recent history, because it feels like the chips have fallen in their favor big time, and they have a lot of opportunities to go out and grab whatever they want. Now let's stop getting ahead of ourselves. Got to go out and beat a UCLA team that's reeling, new coach that did not impress. You got to go out there and take care of business just like you did against Western Illinois. You can only play the team that's in front of you. Go march right through their face, similar to the way they did in FIU. Control the game early and then just sit on it. Let's get out of there with a win, and then we repivot, because I think the conversation gets pretty exciting on Sunday if things handle.
We mentioned teams taking on the personality of their coach. I think we may see a little bit of that with UCLA, and Deshaun Foster's kind of being a little, I've been saying this, shaking in his boots. And I think he might be shaking in his boots right now after what he saw Indiana do on Saturday, even though it was against Western Illinois. So any closing thoughts before we wrap this up, Mitchell?
Just an exciting time to be a fan, man. I know that.
It is.
I'm pumped. I wish I could go out there. I know that.
All right. Appreciate you as always. Looking forward to this, obviously, each and every week. Hopefully the conversation continues to get more and more exciting. And wouldn't that
I'll tell you this, John, we start winning a couple more games. I feel like I'm pretty mellow right now. These things could go off the rails. I might come in full uniform. So let's give it some time, but this could get pretty exciting. So
all right,
let's keep going.
Mitchell Paige with us as always on In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
Big thanks as always to Mitchell Paige for coming on to react to all that went down in the Indiana football games. And again, as we just mentioned, I'm looking forward to the rest of this football season with the Hoosiers, because it is shaping up to be something that I hate to say, I hate getting my hopes up with this, and I'm sure Indiana football fans, a lot of you are feeling the same way, because we've been disappointed time and time again after we've gotten our hopes up. And obviously the most recent time that happened was the year after the 2020 season, when there was really high expectations. You had a really high preseason ranking, and none of that is what happened this year, but just the way that Curt Cignetti carries himself and his attitude about this program has rubbed off on everybody else, excuse me, who pays attention to this football team. And it's just really exciting. And their first, I hate to say their first real test, but I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, every week is a test in its own way for different reasons. But the next step in this Indiana football journey for the 2024 season, in this Curt Cignetti experiment, takes place this Saturday as Indiana travels far west to the West Coast, where they take on UCLA. And again, it's weird to say. It feels like if they don't blow them out, it will be a disappointment, and again, we don't know a whole lot about UCLA, only just that one game that we mentioned when they played Hawaii. And so that's probably why I'm trying to tamper expectations a little bit, just because we don't want to overreact to Indiana. I mean, that's what we're here to do. We're here to share opinions, overreact, whatever it may be. But as we've seen with Iowa, I overreacted to Iowa in week 1. Overreacted to a few teams, as a matter of fact. And so I thought Maryland was going to end up being better. I haven't even mentioned that game. Maryland lost to Michigan State. And I don't think Michigan State's bad. I didn't think they were good enough to beat Maryland, because they could barely take care of business against FAU. And Maryland destroyed UConn 50-7 in week 1. And they couldn't take care of business there. So again, it's all tough to really tell how good your teams actually are in as we get rolling here, as we're only a couple of weeks. I mean, really, if we're being technical, this is week 3. If you want to include week 0, this is kind of the 4th week of college football. Depends on how you look at it. Obviously, it's Indiana's 3rd game. So anyway, we'll put the Indiana football talk to bed for now. Obviously, we'll react to it more as the week goes along. I'm going to try to bring on somebody I know who may be able to give us a little insight on UCLA football potentially. And hopefully we'll do. But my goal is to have him on Wednesday if he's available. But again, haven't reached out to him just yet, and don't even really know what his availability is like. So it may or may not be a possibility, but I'd like to give it a shot and see if we can get a UCLA guy's perspective on what they think this weekend's matchup will look like against the Hoosiers. All right, with that being said, let's move on to the NFL, react to a little NFL action from this weekend. And we'll start local. We'll start with the Colts. Man, the Colts, the Indianapolis Colts, man. They have lost now their 11th straight opener for, to start the season. There's no other way to put that. That's horrible. Since 2013. And it feels like we are so far removed from the days of, and we are, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We're so far removed from the Peyton Manning era and even the good years with Andrew Luck. And let me put it this way. I don't think the Colts quarterback, Anthony Richardson, is to blame here. It was the Colts defense that was the problem on Sunday. You give up as many yards on the ground as they did. Let me see if I can pull that number up. Let's see. Joe Mixon had 160 yards and a touchdown. And that doesn't, I don't know the exact total for the Texans, but Colts probably should have had this one. And I know CJ Stroud is going to end up doing very well for Houston, by the way. They may end up being the best team in the division, but I just don't really know what else to say much about the Colts, other than they've just been in limbo what seems like for years. And it was kind of cool that you got to have this matchup whenever that was the way that your season ended last year in the playoffs, kind of a chance to avenge what happened, and you didn't do that. And it's unfortunate if you're a Colts fan. And we'll move on. Colts next week, who do they got? Let me pull up their schedule real quick before I move forward. In week 2, the Colts will have a chance to rectify this loss against the Packers who will be without Jordan Love, who got injured in their matchup on Friday down in Brazil. And I didn't catch that game for obvious reasons. The Hoosiers were playing, I believe, around the exact same time. But a lot of people complaining about the field conditions down in Brazil. I mean, you're playing on a soccer field, so that's, already something that's, not normal. Heard there was a lot of slipping and sliding. And I don't believe Jordan Love's injury had a lot to do with the field conditions. Either way, it's just I know the NFL is not going to stop playing games in different countries and stuff like that, but it's just unfortunate to not have better playing conditions for, the National Football League. So there you go. Yeah, Colts will have a chance to rectify it. And really, in my opinion, without Jordan Love, should be expected to beat the Packers. So hopefully the Colts will bounce back in week 2. Let's move forward on to the rest of really what I thought was, at least just from my perspective, what I enjoyed from the NFL weekend. My wife's Bills got it done after a really ugly start against the Cardinals. Josh Allen ended up having a hell of a day. And if he was on your fantasy team, he wasn't on mine, but he was on my wife's, then you were definitely a happy camper. And Bills, this is, again, I've said this before, I think. And if I haven't, then welcome, I guess, to this opinion. But the Bills window for getting to the Super Bowl is kind of closing a little bit. And it's nice to see Josh Allen kind of take things into his own hands at times. And if you're a Bills fan, I'm sure you were happy to see him kind of take control of that game yesterday. And the Bills will I'm not going to go over the rest of the schedule for all these teams because I don't have time to keep pulling up these tabs. But Bills look good, especially after a slow start. And speaking of slow starts, this next team I'm going to mention, the Bears. The Bears very easily looked like they were going to get their ass whipped in their game against the Titans. But thanks to a lot of miscues by Titans quarterback Will Levis in the second half and a very opportunistic defense from the Bears, they were able to get it done. And Caleb Williams gets the W in his rookie debut, his official debut, I should say, with the Chicago Bears. And so a lot of Bears fans in my circle of friends, so I know they were sure they were happy about how that one went down. Bengals laid an egg. Joe Burrow, he's on my fantasy team. Thankfully, I didn't need him to have that good of a week to still pull out the victory in my fantasy league. Got a 3-point victory, so very happy to get the the win, my first ever win and my first ever attempt in the fantasy football league. But the Bengals, a lot of, I don't want to say it's drama necessarily, but there was a lot of chatter before the game began, specifically surrounding Jamar Chase, saying he wasn't going to play without getting a new contract, and he ended up playing anyway. And again, I started both him and Joe Burrow, by the way, on my fantasy team, and it just ended up not being a good day for the Bengals. Lost to the Patriots at home. I don't think the Patriots are very good. Maybe they end up being decent, but that is not a good way to start your season, as I do believe the Bengals will go on to play the Chiefs in week 2. So not a very good start to the season for the Cincinnati Bengals. On the other end of this, actually, this isn't really the other end of anything. Just couldn't think of a better transition, I guess, for this next story. But the Cowboys whooping up on the Browns right after Dak Prescott gets the most expensive contract in NFL history. I don't even know if that's deserved. I mean, I know he's a good quarterback, but what has he done with the Cowboys to deserve that? Your guess is as good as mine, but maybe this is the year that the Cowboys do something. Obviously, they went up against the Browns, and the Browns were known to have maybe the best defense in the NFL last year, and they put up 33 points on them, being 33-17 on the road. And speaking of which, I haven't mentioned much about my NFL bets because they didn't do much for me this weekend, but I thought the Browns were going to cover this game, and they were far from doing that. Browns were 2.5-point favorites, end up losing by, 16? And maybe the Cowboys are in for a good season. And I know they haven't been bad the last couple of years. Just it's been a while since they've really been on the doorstep of a Super Bowl. So we'll see if they can get it done this year or, take another step forward. We'll have to see. On the another side of when it comes to drama, Tyreek Hill and the Dolphins, man, that was very weird to see happening on the lead up to their kickoff. So Tyreek Hill got arrested for some sort of moving violation before the Dolphins kicked off on Sunday. He ended up playing, of course, had an 80-yard touchdown. But just imagine if he had not been Tyreek Hill, and I think he put this on social media, what would have happened to him? I'm sure obviously he gets let go because he's Tyreek Hill, but it's just very weird. I feel like he's got a history of being in trouble. I don't know that for facts. So I don't want to speak too much on it, but on the day of your opening game, to do something to put yourself in a position to be arrested. And again, I don't know all of the details with it, but it just seems a little odd, that situation, the way that it played out. And then obviously him ultimately being let go and getting to play and being an instrumental part in their win against the Jaguars. Just a very interesting situation. That's about all of the interesting stuff I've got from the NFL. These things that interested me. Maybe some of the other games interested you. I'll hit on a few different NFL things each and every week. At least I'll do my best to. But then tonight, we've got Monday Night Football. First Monday Night Football and the return of Aaron Rodgers. Will he avoid injury on the first snap of the game like he couldn't last year? I think it was the first snap of the game. It was very early if it wasn't the very first snap. But a lot of people aren't fans of Aaron Rodgers anymore. But if you are, if you're a Jets fan or if you like Aaron Rodgers in general, kudos to you. But a lot of people, I feel like, are just kind of waiting for Aaron Rodgers, old grandpa Aaron Rodgers, to just make his way out of the league. And I don't really have a rooting interest on either side of that. But it will be interesting to see whether or not he's able to put together a good performance and stay healthy this year. And really in this first game, can he get past the first game? Because if he were to suffer a similar fate this year, it'd be hard for me to see him, going through another full off season of rehabbing an injury and then trying out after consecutive years of that. But again, that remains to be seen. If you're going to bet tonight, the 49ers currently 3.5-point favorites, total set at 43.5. Probably won't bet on this. Again, I just want to have some skin in the game. That's why I bet a little parlay this past weekend. One of 3 legs hit. The leg that did hit was Detroit covering against the Rams, and they needed overtime to do that. And then I had the Dolphins covering against the Jaguars. They were off by a point. And then, I wasn't even close when it came to what happened with the Browns and the Cowboys. One last piece of news from the NFL side of things. Kendrick Lamar is doing the halftime, almost said the halftime report, the Super Bowl halftime show this year. And I don't really have super big opinions on this either way. I think it could have been a worse selection, could have been better, of course. Obviously, the type of music that I like is more than likely never going to be represented, or at least very rarely represented in this day and age of Super Bowl halftime shows, because obviously, for those of you who know me, I'm a big rock and metal guy. Most of the bands that I enjoy, I mean, there's probably one band that I could see doing the Super Bowl halftime report that fits that rock and metal sphere, if you will, at least in the next few years, and that's Metallica. And that's because they're kind of getting up there in age, but they're also still extremely popular. And I think they would they put on a really good show if they got the chance to do a Super Bowl halftime. Again, they don't need it. And a lot of these acts, I mean, none of these major acts need the Super Bowl halftime show. It's more of, I don't want to say it's a novelty. Maybe that is the best way to describe it. But we'll just have to wait and see what ends up happening with Kendrick Lamar. So, I don't know much of his music. I like some of his songs, some of his verses, if you will. And I'm sounding very nerdy when it comes to not knowing Kendrick Lamar. Maybe a lot of you are big Kendrick Lamar fans. I know there was a lot of friends I had in college that were really into Kendrick Lamar. But again, there was a phase. I did go through a rap phase when I was in middle school. I was into a guy named B.O.B., Bobby Ray. And he's since fallen way off the map, kind of gone a little crazy, if you will. I hate to say that because I still listen to him from time to time, but he's come out as kind of a big flat earther, and he's into a lot of conspiracy theories, which it's interesting. But I don't think I can take a lot of that super seriously. It is fun to listen to songs about it now and again, but it's just, again, totally not my lane, I guess, when it comes to music of choice. But I guess shout out to Kendrick Lamar if you're into that. I'm sure even when I don't enjoy the music of the halftime show, I do think a lot of the performers put on a good visual display to just kind of enjoy in between halves of the Super Bowl, of course. So I'm sure with something like that, you'll have plenty of guests coming on with them to do songs with them. Obviously, a lot of rap music in general has a lot of guest appearances and songs. So I'm sure he'll bring a myriad of, friends along with him, if you will, to partake in the Super Bowl halftime events this year. So I think that's about going to wrap it up for us today on a Monday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports. Thanks for hanging around. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and we will do this again on Wednesday for a midweek edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. And I guess until then, we'll talk to you on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. We'll talk to you then.